Before we take a photograph, there are two things that happen that we do without realizing. First of all, think of yourself as an explorer. We go out, we're looking for the perfect photograph, we're trying to find them in the environment around us. When we find that perfect photograph, when it has been revealed to us, then our second ability kicks in, and that's our composition. We suddenly become composers. We think about how we want to arrange the elements of the photograph, what we want the viewer to focus on, and specifically what it is that we capture. And composition is the key to good photography. Of course, everybody has their own opinion about what is a good photograph, but I'll help you in this lesson to get you on your way to better looking shots. My name is William Eames, and welcome back to Smartphone Photography. At this stage, you should well know how to attend your lessons. Remember to join using those reminders or through your student area and download the app if you haven't done so already. The main thing to remember at this point is that it is always possible to reschedule your lessons if needs be. So if you're falling a bit behind, remember you can watch recordings or you can just also start the entire course again if you prefer to attend them at the scheduled times. So do remember that's possible to do at any stage throughout the course. Now, so let's get into our lesson. So composition, lesson number 3. I want to make sure you get it perfect every single time. And composition, unlike our technical ability, is something that will only come with practice. Now, it is subjective. That's the one thing I'll say at the very start of this lesson. What we consider to be good and what we consider to be a bad photograph is somewhat a matter of opinion. That said, if you're going to argue that a particular photograph that you think is good, that someone else thinks is bad, you really need to have the knowledge and the know-how to back up your argument. So we'll have a look at how you can improve your photographs by following a couple of guidelines. And of course, like anything, once you know the rules, you can go and you can break them and you can make your photographs be more unique. So first of all, we're going to kick things off about what is good and what is bad when it comes to composition. A couple of terms to get familiar with as per usual. Composition itself, the words, point of view, POV, rule of thirds, balance, cropping, aspect ratio, and focusing modes. These are all things that we're going to be speaking about throughout the lesson. And when we kick things off with composition, we talk about, first of all, good composition. What is a well-composed photograph? With our photographs, we're composing all of the elements, we're arranging everything within the photograph, instantaneously, really, without even realizing it in some cases, to create a photograph that looks good to us. So, good composition, the main subject is clearly communicated to the viewer. Focus, exposure, and composition guidelines are all correct. Now, I say that in inverted commas because, again, it's subjective, but there is still some rules that we have to follow. The viewer's attention is held. The viewer engages with the photograph. They don't just look at it, don't know what they're looking at, and move on. The use of colour, motion, and depth of field all contribute. These are all compositional elements, things we'll have a look at throughout the rest of this course. It's free of distractions to the foreground or background. Your viewer's eye is being taken off the subject because of some kind of distraction happening in the foreground or the background. And basically the photograph feels and looks well balanced and is satisfying to look at. It's aesthetically pleasing and we come away from it thinking, well, that's a good photograph. And here is an example of that. So here we've got a nice photograph here of a jetty and we have a nice sunset. Our horizon is perfectly straight. It's positioned correctly as well. It's not too high. It's not too low. It's not in the middle either, and which can be a little bit jarring sometimes. So we've got a nice balance there. We've got roughly 1/3 of the sky still in here and 2/3 of the rest of the photograph is made up of the sea and of the jetty here. It's well exposed. There's full of detail and colour. We can see all of the texture of the water. There's nothing that's too dark or too bright, obviously apart from the sun itself, which would be impossible to capture in this type of exposure. Use of shape and line lines lead the viewer's eyes. So we've got this triangular shape here that's bringing us through the photograph with this kind of line as well, just leading us into the shot. And we've got this horizon then, which also caps it off very, very nicely as well. So there's a nice use of shapes here in the photograph too. And it's in focus and the subject is very clear. We understand what we're looking at here. We're being led through the photograph, down this jetty, through the use of leading lines, and to enjoy the sunset in the distance. Now, let's have a look at what we would consider bad practices when it comes to bad photographs. First of all, the subject is out of focus. It's an unclear subject. The viewer is not sure what they're looking at. The viewer attention then wanders because they're not sure what they're looking at. There's full of distractions in the photograph. So there's things in the shot that are taken away from our primary subject. It may be poorly cropped. So you might have decided to crop into the photograph, but you've made a good photograph bad by poorly cropping into the shot, and there's little or no balance. Things just don't feel right, things feel irregular, and it's just uninteresting to look at. It's just not a visually interesting subject. So here is an example of that. So this is a photograph here where, first of all, straight away we can kind of see that it's out of focus, but we can see the top of the head is incorrectly cropped. The eye line is too high up here in this instance. It's too close to the top, so it's not been correctly cropped at all. There's no sense of room or space. It's very tight. It's very claustrophobic. There is a technique where we can fill the frame with our subject, but this is a little bit different. It's unbalanced. There's no sense of room or space. As I mentioned, it's quite claustrophobic looking photograph. Details are lost in the overexposure here. We're losing details in the highlights there, and it's out of focus. So these are just some elements here that show that this is a poor photograph. So the first thing that I recommend when you're out there photographing is to explore your subject. The key to good composition is to take time with your subject, whether you're photographing a person or whether you're photographing objects, etc. You want to take time to explore your subject. You're not going to get that photograph in one unless you're very, very lucky. Use your environment. Think about what's in the foreground and background, but only use them to create a sense of space, a sense of place. Don't use them as distractions in your photographs. You still want your main subject to be clear and apparent. If you're photographing people, or if you're photographing food, think about using props as well to improve your composition, to help give a balance to the photograph, or even just introduce a little bit of color as well. Have some kind of plan, some kind of idea of what it is that you want to capture. In my experience, you should always have a plan, but things never go according to plan. But you've always got that kind of backup there if needs be, especially when it comes to photographing professional events. But do have some idea of what, in your mind's eye, of what you want to capture. That said, best photographs are usually spontaneous. The best photographs usually just happen, and it gets to a stage as you improve with your photography, you'll be able to anticipate and almost predict when something is going to happen to get the shot. Communicate with your subject, and communicate with your viewer. Remember, ultimately, whatever it is that you're trying to photograph, that you're trying to capture, it's going to be viewed by someone else. So think about that communication, exactly what it is that you're trying to communicate in your photograph. Be patient, take your time. It's not going to happen straight away. You need to spend time and be patient. Patience is one of the most important skills that a photographer needs to develop. And you will learn how to anticipate. You'll learn how to anticipate when something good is going to happen, something interesting is going to happen. Particularly important when it comes to things like wildlife and street photography. You need to have an awareness of what's going on and be ready to react to it. And just to give you some examples of that, so here's some famous examples. So this one from Masayoshi Sugita, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Bowie from 1977 for the Hero session. Of course, ended up being on the album cover. So as you can see here, this is roll of medium format film, 12 exposures here, and we can see very, very clearly the shot that he marked off as being one of the better ones. And you can also see some of the other two here as well, but this was the keeper. But you can see the process here. You can see how he's kind of moving, through these different motions until that moment of magic happened. Okay, so that's one example. Here we've got another very famous example from Dorothea Lange, the Migrant Mother series, the middle image here being one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. But you can see the other photographs here as well. While still interesting, they don't have that extra quality that the middle image holds, that middle image that has almost kind of a religious kind of quality to it, compared to the other photographs. But the other photographs really kind of showing the desolation and the struggle as well. So just two examples there just to show you that you're not going to get it in one. You need to spend time and explore your subject. Now, you've already heard me mention a couple of times all about balance. What do I mean about balance? So balance refers to the compositional weight of objects in a photograph. That means that some objects have a lot of compositional weight, meaning that our eyes are drawn to them and they need to be balanced out then with another compositional weight. Viewers' eyes will tend to wander if a photograph is unbalanced. This is when we may not even notice something happening in the photograph because we're distracted by something else in the photo. And again, balance will come with practice. But think of each element, each compositional element, each thing that you decide to put into your photograph as being part of a scale. We want to try and keep that scale level. So let's make this visual so you understand exactly what I mean. So here we have a photograph. Take your time with this, have a look at it. And think about where your eyes are going in this shot. Okay, so where did it go? So if I'm looking at this photograph, I'm tending to start at the rocks down at the bottom, work my way over onto the left hand side, but then I'm brought back over to the right by the lighthouse in the distance. So I take in the entire photograph. Let's say we remove one of the compositional elements to this shot, and we take away the lighthouse and the island. Okay, so we're going to remove the lighthouse and the island, and suddenly the photograph becomes quite different. So now think about where we are looking in the shot, and certainly my eye is being drawn over to the rocks on the left hand side. That is because they're dark, they're much darker than everything else in the photograph. They just seem a little bit out of place now because we have lost the balance of the photograph. So it just looks unbalanced. It doesn't look correct to our eyes. If I bring back our lighthouse, so it pops back into the image, we can see that we have that balance in the shot. So it's actually usually easier to identify an unbalanced photograph than it is a balanced photograph. So if you're looking at a shot and you feel there's something not right about it, it may be that there is a lack of balance to it. So it's something else to be aware of. Now, moving on to our focusing modes then. So I get asked about focusing modes very, very frequently. And on our smartphones, we have 3 different primary focusing modes. First one is AFS, which is our main focus mode, or one that we typically use by default. AF means autofocus, S means single, so AFS means autofocus single shot. Now what this means is that when we take a photograph, we focus the image, or the camera will focus itself. We take our photograph, and the next time we take a photograph, the camera will focus again. It doesn't keep the focus from the last image. So every subsequent photograph that we take, the camera will have to focus each time. That's what it means by AFS. Now, of course, we can still choose where we want to focus using AFS. We simply touch on the subject, like in this image here in the giraffe. We just simply press onto the giraffe's face and the camera will take its focus from there. If we were to take another photograph, we would need to do the same thing again. The camera will choose the focus for us. So that's AFS, our standard focusing mode. Now for fast moving subjects like children, we have an option called AFC. This means autofocus continuous. And this means that the camera is constantly focusing. It's always focusing. We don't have much control over this ourselves because the camera is doing all the work in regards to focusing, and it essentially tracks moving subjects. So like in this image, you see all these little focus points come up because it's tracking a moving subject. It's a very complex focusing system. Great for fast moving subjects, so like children running, but anything like sports photography, if you're trying to capture a moving car, anything like that, you want to use your AFC, your autofocus continuing mode. Finally then, we have our manual focusing mode. So sometimes the autofocus just will fail us altogether. It just can't get the focus right. Usually in lower light situations, this is an issue. So if we're trying to do a portrait at night, the camera may really struggle to focus. This is when we can rely on manual focus. This is basically, we just simply choose to focus ourselves by touching the screen where we want the focus to come from. Now, the camera will not do any autofocus at all. So just remember that the next photograph that you take, the manual focus will be set from the previous image that you took. So the camera is not going to do anything in regards to the focus, so you will have to keep refocusing the image manually if you're sticking to using manual focus mode. Now, of course, there's many more focusing modes available than this, which we will look at in due time. But these are the three primary ones that you should be using and are available on the majority of phones. Now, answer me this, a very simple yes or no question. Have you ever seen this photograph before? Okay, so if you're watching this on a laptop or a desktop, don't worry, your computer hasn't just cut out and just revealed the background. So chances are you have seen this photograph before. Very simple yes or no answer, and you can just simply type it into Morpheus as usual. Let us know if you have seen this photograph, and remember to rate those responses so we continually improve them for you. But this photograph, this is Bliss, and it's perhaps the most viewed photograph taken in the world, taken in 1996 by Charles O'Rear, who was a National Geographic photographer along the Northern Californian Highway. A lot of people at the time, and still nowadays, think the image was photoshopped or was simply not real, because there's an unreal kind of quality to it, but it really is all just about the quality of the light in the photograph. Many people have gone back to this spot and photographed it again and have gone nowhere near the quality of the shot that Charles O'Rear did back in 1996. Now, it's considered the most viewed photograph of all time because, of course, it was available on Windows, and so many people had Windows PCs. But, of course, that may change, and most likely will change over the next few years, especially in if you think about Instagram and the amount of people that are posting up on that. There you go, a little bit of trivia for you. Now, so moving into our second topic, we're going to have a look at guidelines and tips that you can use to start improving your composition straight away. So keeping in mind the tips that we had in the first part of this lesson, these are guidelines that will help you, that you can draw upon to make sure that you get a good composition nearly every single time. So some of these you may have heard of before, some of these might be brand new to you. The rule of thirds, symmetry, leading lines, the golden ratio, and point of view. Now, of course, there's way more than this, but these are the main ones we'll focus on in this lesson. And as we continue on with our landscape and our portrait photography lesson in particular, we'll explore many more compositional guidelines. But let's start off with the most popular one, which is the rule of thirds. This one is so popular that it's pretty much built into every single camera and phone that you will purchase nowadays. So let's have a look at this photograph here. So we can feel that there's a good sense of balance here in this photograph. First of all, we've got a nice kind of tonality going on through the photograph here too. But the idea with the rule of thirds is that we have this imaginary grid that's made up of two horizontal lines and two vertical lines equally spaced. So if we overlay that on this photograph, we can see that we have these two horizontal lines going right across the top of the mountains there, and very, very close to the walkway here as well. Then the vertical lines, we have our we've got the kind of lamppost there, and then we also have the pier at the end and the people sitting there as well. Now, the idea with the rule of thirds is that you want to use it as a guide that your compositional elements will fall somewhere within or close to these points. So the points where the horizontal and the vertical meet, you want your interesting parts of your photograph to fall somewhere near them, and it will help to give a natural sense of balance to the photograph. Let's look at some examples of this. Now here we've got a portrait taken in landscape format. We can also see here there's not much going on here over on the left hand side of the photograph, but that's absolutely fine. There is still a sense that this photograph is properly composed. And if I bring over my overlay here again, we can see that this gentleman has been positioned to the right part of the photograph, where he is basically falling on that right vertical line. That space that we have over on the left hand side, that's known as negative space, and even though it's called negative space, it's actually something beneficial to your photographs. It gives a sense of room and it gives a sense of space, and something like this is a great technique for photographing portraits in landscape format. Let's look at it in portrait format, so it's not just limited to photographing in landscape format. If we photograph in portrait format, that is with our phone's vertical, we can still see that we have our rule of thirds applied. And again, in this photograph, we've placed the seal's head at one of the points where the vertical and the horizontal meet, and it gives a logical sense of placement. Again, everything else in this photograph here, all of the water around here, it doesn't feel like it's taken away from the photograph. Again, a lot of negative space, but there's a logical sense of placement here because we've used the rule of thirds to correctly balance this photograph. If we were to change it and have the seal's head in the center of the frame, it wouldn't really give us the same effect at all. And again, portraits in portrait format can be done using the rule of thirds as well. This is a really good example where we have that that vertical line over here on the right. It's perfectly falling on where the light is falling off. So this is a really good example of how light is used as a compositional technique to create this really powerful, quite stunning photograph. So and again, perfectly aligned using the rule of thirds. So it's a guideline. It's a really good fallback for you if you're struggling to get a couple of shots. I will always take at least one photograph using the rule of thirds, just so I know that I have one that is usable. So it's a really good one to use, and it's great that you probably have seen on your phones already. It can be switched on, it can be switched off. Have a look at the display settings in your phones if you're unable to find it, but I recommend having it switched on, at least if you're brand new to photography. Now, so moving away from our rule of thirds, we also have symmetry, and symmetry is a lot of fun. It's a great compositional technique to play around with and to explore. And the idea with symmetry is that we want to find something that's symmetrical, and when we speak about symmetrical, we can think about it from top to bottom and from left to right. So this is a really good example of both of them, the Eiffel Tower. So we can see we've got a kind of a symmetry going from top to bottom because we have the reflection of the tower in the pool here. But we also have a symmetry going from left to right because we have that kind of those lines leading us into the photograph. They're pretty much mirrored on both sides of it. So this is a really good example of top to bottom and left to right. So think about this with symmetry, and with symmetry you always want to have your main subject and focus right in the center of the frame. So the viewer's eyes should be brought right through into the middle of the frame. Here is another example. Now this one here is a left to right example of symmetry. We haven't got a top to bottom in this particular instance, but symmetry is brilliant for doing architectural photography in particular, because lots of buildings are made, designed to be symmetrical. So if you're into doing architecture and you want to capture a little bit of symmetry, it's a really, really good thing to try out and to play around with. So here we can see, as I said, we've got a simple left to right symmetry in this instance. Moving on, one of the most popular compositional techniques is the use of leading lines. And as you can kind of guess, leading lines will lead us through the photograph. We pick a line and it brings us through the shot. Let's have a look at an example here. Very straightforward example. We can see very, very clearly we have this triangular shape, this bridge that is literally leading us through the shot. all converges in a point in the distance. So it brings our attention all the way across the bridge, all the way into the distance. Might be a little bit difficult to see it if you're watching on a phone, but there's an American flag all the way down there in the end. So good use of leading lines there. Here's another good example in London. As you can see, a lot more leading lines happening in this shot. So the photographer has got down quite low here to get the leading lines. We can see we've got the lines on the edge of the bridge here over on the left hand side. We've got the line of the curb. We've got those double yellow lines here as well. We've got that bicycle lane line, and we've got the lines of the long exposure of the cars and the bus. So, all of these kind of coming together to bring us right through into the middle of the photograph. It's a superb example. Now, one that you may have heard of a lot, but wondered what it is the golden ratio. The golden ratio, which is one that is used a lot in art as well, and has had made its way into photography. So the golden ratio is based on an idea that certain objects and certain things around us have a kind of a natural balance to them. And this is based on a mathematical sequence of numbers known as the Fibonacci sequence, where you're adding up numbers based on the previous number. So, for example, you've got 1, and then 1 plus 1 equals 2, and then 2 plus 1 equals 3, 3 plus 2 equals 5, 5 plus 3 equals 8, etc. It keeps going on in that way. And the idea is that it creates this perfect proportion, as you can see. So it's a Fibonacci spiral is also what it is known as well. And this is a really good example of it here. As we can see, it's got quite a low horizon here, but it still works. It still looks like everything is placed correctly within the photograph. Now, the Fibonacci spiral, or the golden ratio, whatever you prefer to call it, it is a trickier one to master. But if you start with the rule of thirds, that's a good place to start, because the reality is they're not too far away from each other. The golden spiral, or the Fibonacci sequence, whatever you want to call it, just that little bit trickier to get right. But again, look at this, is a great example of it. So with those tips and guidelines in mind, we can mix it all up by changing our point of view. And point of view is not the same as our angle of view that we saw with our lenses in the previous lesson. Point of view is simply the direction that we look in. So for example, as simply looking up is going to create a unique perspective for our photographs. It's great for shapes and leading lines. And think about doing it when you're in forests, like in the example here, or in cities as well, where the action is above us. There's plenty going on overhead at all times. Be sure to look up now and again and capture a shot. And wide shots work very well for this, like in this great example. Low angles are also good for portraits as well, like in this particular instance. You do need to be careful. It can be unflattering. So, always be sure to take time to pose the person correctly as well. But it does give a sense of strength and power. Like in this photograph, there is an authority to the image. So, and also think about using the environment to frame your subject for a stronger composition. Now, of course, think about the angle of light as well. You don't want to try and have your subject facing directly into the light, but maybe have them facing away or side on. So always be considering your light and the direction of where it's coming from as well. From above is also a great perspective. It's nice and relaxed. It gives a real sense of playfulness, the sense of ease and rest. But it's much more casual. It wouldn't be great for doing more kind of corporate or professional work where they're looking for something a little bit more sophisticated. But for friends and family, that it's a great angle to be photographing them from. When you're in concerts, when you're in anywhere with a crowds are difficult to photograph in any situation, even with the most sophisticated cameras. Just hold it up. Just gives a great sense of being in the action, of being right in there in the moment. The delay timer, as I've mentioned in our first lesson, is very, very useful for this as well. But always be conscious of the people behind you as well. They don't want to be watching the concert through your phone. So, if you are doing this and you're doing this type of photography, be respectful of everybody around you as well so that you don't annoy them. And perhaps one of the most important things that I can say when photographing children in particular is to get to their level, get down to their height. It's no good just to be photographing them up from above. It creates a sense of disconnection. As I mentioned previously as well, you should be making connections with the eyes where possible. So getting to a child's level brings us into their world and makes the connection. You just couldn't get this type of photograph if you were kind of towering above them. It would be a much more kind of intimidating almost kind of photograph, I suppose, from a child's perspective. And as I mentioned, standing above creates a disconnection with the child, with the viewer, and even just getting back down to their level brings us back to our own childhood and reminds us when we were that small as well. Also, don't forget to do this for your pets as well. See the world through their eyes, getting low down with your cats, with your dogs, with your tortoises, with your goldfish, whatever it is you happen to have. And again, practice the same techniques here as well. See the world from their perspective. Now, so I just want to give a quick look at what's coming up in the next lesson. We're going to be having a look all about motion and depth. Good example here of it, the motion of the running water and the nice shallow depth of field there behind it. So we're going to have a look at how we can control those two things within our phones. This will also add to our compositional techniques as well, because we can choose to add in motion and depth into one of the compositional techniques that we've had a look at in this lesson. Now, just with our skills as well, so we've added quite a lot of skills in this lesson, particularly with our creative ability. So it's great to see that actually move on quite significantly. Our vocabulary is expanding in every single lesson, and a little bit of editing and advanced skills as well. Editing is actually something that happens in camera as well. Editing is not just applying changes to your photographs after they've been captured. It's about thinking what photographs you want to keep, and even that thought of composing could be considered almost editing as well, because you're deciding what you want to put in the frame and what you want to leave out. Now, so our final topic, just a short little topic to round things off. Just want to briefly speak about cropping and aspect ratio. So first of all, cropping is basically when we crop in on a photograph, we take the shot and we decide to take out parts of the photograph retrospectively. And I just want to say it's okay to crop a photograph. There's this romantic idea that photographs need to try and get everything right in camera. This is a very restrictive way to work. It just simply doesn't work. It's very difficult to get, no matter how much we try, to get that one perfect shot. I mean, we should always, I suppose, in a sense, strive for it, but it's absolutely fine to crop in afterwards. Sometimes you'll see something in a shot afterwards. You want to remove distractions or something like that. Cropping is just another tool, another skill that you can use and that you can rely on. But you should still use cropping within the guidelines and the parameters that I've outlined in this lesson. Now, just to give you an example of this, perhaps one of the most famous photographs again in the 20th century, from a more artistic perspective, is Henri Cartier-Bresson. Very, very famous photograph here. And he was notorious for never wanting to crop his photographs. He avoided it pretty much every single shot he took. He's like, has to be all captured within what he calls the decisive moment. However, he photographed this one through a railing, which you can see very, very clearly here over on the left-hand side of the right image. Okay, you can see that he had to crop that out. So that obviously ruins the photograph. It's a major distraction, but by taking it out, then we get this really incredible photograph where we've got the jumping man and the ballerina there behind him, kind of mimicking him, what he's doing on the poster. So it is absolutely fine to crop. Now, just to speak about aspect ratio, this simply refers to the shape of the photograph. It's the width and the height, the relationship between the width and the height of the shot. Lots of different aspect ratios here. Aspect ratio is something that applies very much in cinema as well. And it's just simply the shape of our photograph. And we can use different aspect ratios to give a different sense of placement within the shot. So starting off with a 1-to-1 ratio is simply a square photograph, a square format. And if you remember back to the early days of Instagram, everything was in this ratio. Quite frustrating for photographers at that time. In a way though, 1-to-1 ratio is actually what a lot of medium format cameras will shoot. They'll could do a perfect square like this, but as you can see, it's still following the rule of thirds. We still have our guidelines here, kind of helping to balance the shot, and it's great for portraits, great for doing portraits, but not limited to that at all. You can use it for any purpose really. Then we have our 4-to-3 ratio. This one was a movie standard ratio actually for a very, very long time, and a TV standard ratio as well. Our old TV screens would have followed a format very, very similar to this. It's also a photographic format as well. This one is also, I find, to be very, very nice for doing kind of portrait photography as well, just to give a little bit of space around the subject too. But again, absolutely not limited to what you want to do with this format. Probably the one that we use most frequently, most often nowadays, is our 3-to-2 ratio. This is essentially giving us the entire frame, as you can see here. We have all of the photograph here, and if you're trying to just get cover yourself with your photography, you should just be photographing in 3-to-2. It should be your standard, and it's always possible then to kind of crop into those other aspect ratios afterwards if needs be. It is nice to photograph in those aspect ratios though as well within your phone, because it'll help train your eyes, it'll help to train them to see using those different ratios. Finally then, we have our 16:9 ratio, which is our widescreen format, and this is great if you're after kind of a cinematic quality to your shots. Widescreen being the standard nowadays for cinema and indeed for television as well. So if you're after that type of shot, that type of perspective, 16:9 is the way to go. And of course, certainly for your video as well, you should be considering photographing or videoing in 16:9. Now, so that is the end of our lesson. Coming up in lesson 4, just have a quick look at it, we're going to be having a look at motion and depth. As I mentioned, we're going to have a look at how we can control motion to create blurry photographs like in the center here, how we can track subjects to freeze them in motion, and how we can also obtain shallow depth of field using our phones as well. It's a very important lesson because these are also parameters for controlling exposure too, so you really need to understand shutter speed and aperture to capture motion and depth. Now, as usual, please remember to rate the lessons. Well done on completing lesson number 3. We're absolutely flying now through the course. I do hope that you've been enjoying it so far. You have a challenge, of course, and I'd like you just to display a photograph using one of the guidelines outlined in this lesson. So whether it's the rule of thirds, the golden ratio, perspective change, using a different kind of point of view, whichever one you prefer, display a photograph using one of the guidelines and use the standard hashtag ShawSmartPhoto. And you can post it on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook as well. So thank you so much as well for everybody who's been posting so far. It's really great to see all the work and all in the engagements that you're doing, and I do hope that it's helping with your photography. So I'm going to leave it there for this lesson. Thank you so much for joining me once again, and I will see you all back again very, very soon for lesson number 4. So until then, take care of yourselves and bye bye.